Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this next in the COVID webinar series from the Productivity Insights Network. People are still joining, but we'll start to try and keep to the hour that we've got assigned. As you see today's session, you know it's about the sectoral and spatial impacts of the pandemic and what things might look like in the recovery. Just in case you don't know about the Productivity Insights Network, it's an ESRC funded project involving these institutions, multidisciplinary. And among those, you'll see Cambridge Econometrics and the University of Cardiff. And I'm Richard Lewney from Cambridge Econometrics, and I'll be speaking first. My colleague Ben Gardiner will speak next, and Rob Huggins from Cardiff will be third. And our plan is to speak in total for about 40 minutes and leave 20 minutes for questions. So we'll take questions at the end. The next webinar in the series will be in September, and you'll see the ad for that now on the screen, and you'll get an email to give you more information about that when it becomes available. So the three of us are covering these themes in this session. I'm going to say something about the macro-sectoral position. Some things about this crisis are unique, but some are not, and maybe as it goes on, it maybe becomes less typical features maybe will start to re-emerge. Ben's going to speak about what's driving the spatial distribution of impact. And then Rob's going to speak about the importance of human behaviour and the way that can entrench disparities. So there's a Q&A function. Usually it's at the bottom of the screen if your mouse hovers down there. So post your questions there and we'll take them all at the end. So do post them as we go along, as they occur to you. Okay. So obviously this crisis is unique in terms of what's triggered it. We've not seen anything quite like this before. The biggest fall in GDP on record, as we all know. And just as a reminder, that was bad back in 2000, what we used to call the Great, or maybe still do call the Great Recession of 2008. And the sharpest rise in unemployment. This is the claimant count, but obviously there's the labour force survey measure as well, which is showing things maybe not quite as extreme, but a severe impact. And we know, of course, that unemployment would have risen a lot more if it were not for the furlough scheme and the other support measures. Some sectors have been hit worse than others, obviously. Some extremely, the ones that just simply could not operate because they were not allowed to operate because of social distancing requirements when the lockdown was particularly in force. And some, I mean, motor vehicles is kind of an interesting one. I mean, to some extent, could people work together in factories, but also the sales of those vehicles. Clearly, if forecourts were closed and so on, the possibility of operating couldn't exist, and maybe also fear anyway that people would just save their money and not buy motor vehicles. So as typically happens in a recession, those kind of consumer durables get hit. There's this helpful graphic from the Bank of England, which just looks at household spending, and within that breaks down the kinds of areas of spending that are social and therefore could not happen during the lockdown. The ones that were work-related are work-related and therefore happen much less if people aren't traveling to work. Things that can be put off, so maybe they'll bounce back, but they can be put off for the time being, including households' purchases of cars there, and then things that by and large continue, but maybe through different channels, as we know, much more online and less retail. So a lot of that's unique, but what may go on from here may not be so unique. And this chart shows the two previous recessions. It shows what happened to GDP growth and this the larger fall in the last recession. But it also shows what's happening to household net lending, which is it's a measure essentially means if net lending goes up, households are borrowing and spending less. And maybe contrary to what we might think, well, as a recession hits, people are forced to go into debt and borrow more, and that may happen initially, but pretty quickly, households start deleveraging, and particularly as in this case, as support schemes are scaled back, it seems quite likely that the usual effects will come through, and debt repayment will occur, precautionary saving, which risk prolonging the recession. And that's the sort of macro impact that's quite apart from the question of a second wave of the virus and renewed lockdown, but simply the bounce back may not be as quick as the V-shaped recovery that I'm not sure people necessarily thought would happen, but with the stylized depictions that people were trying to forecast the speed of recovery picked on first, as it were. And there's kind of evidence of that. This is a report from Bloomberg from a month or so ago, just noting that not only in the UK, but elsewhere, bank deposits were going up. Now, of course, initially that was just because people couldn't spend on social consumption, but it's kind of the first indication, I guess, of this turn to saving, initially forced, but maybe becoming a choice as uncertainty continues. So what sort of threat, since this is about really productivity, not just about GDP, what are the impact? Clearly during the recession, productivity will have completely slumped because jobs have been protected by and large, well, a number of jobs have been protected, while spending and output have dropped away. So, but looking forward to what might be the sort of longer term impact on productivity, clearly we've got the risk of this vicious circle of weak demand and therefore investment being cut, and therefore productivity being hit, and hit not just for a matter of months. We have the risk of lost capacity through firm closures, and insofar as that takes time to rebuild, that's a loss which extends the period of recovery. There's the risk that, I mean, presumably, if previous recessions are anything to go by, productivity will be restored by firms to some extent, but that can happen in a number of ways, and the risk is it happens through heavy job shedding as the support measures come to an end, rather than a sustained growth rebound if households are being cautious in their spending, and firms. Obviously, we have the risk of, so it's been spoken about a lot, of high youth unemployment and long-term impacts on skills, employability, and maybe as people are thinking about doing things differently, maybe there are some stranded high street and office assets, stranded in the sense that if our ways of spending and working change, then maybe some of those property assets are not so valuable in the future. So quite a number of downsides, at least one upside, and that is that in the same way that people might be thinking about working differently, they're thinking about investing in resilience, because we all have the sense that this is maybe not just going to disappear quickly, and that could be, for example, automation, communications, shorter supply chains, and those kind of things. And those are investment spending, which you'd expect to improve productivity. So that's my kind of brief macro sectoral introduction, and Ben's going to carry on with spatial impacts.
Thanks, Richard. Just before I get going, I should just add that both mine and Richard's parts are going to be in a forthcoming book by Productivity Insights Network, looking at COVID and the effects on productivity. And we should also obviously acknowledge co-author Professor Ron Martin at Cambridge University, who's done a lot to contribute to what you'll see here. And what you'll see here is a very condensed version, bits of what we've been looking at when we've been kind of getting our heads around the macro, sector and spatial elements. Before I dive into the sector and spatial side, just a more fundamental question of why are we here, which is to do with the productivity instance network, and to kind of get our heads around the productivity puzzle, which is really what this chart, I think, encapsulates quite well. What it shows is the extent to which productivity has recovered for comparing previous recessions. So you take the peak of where productivity was just before the onset of previous recessions, the names of which are down on the bottom of the chart, and then you can trace via an indexing mechanism how quickly things return to what's called normal, as it were. And what you typically see in these situations, as Richard's described, is that initial downward shock to productivity, and then a gradual recovery towards what used to be called a long run or normal trend for various drivers because of that. Now, what immediately becomes evident is the comparison between what we call the Great Moderation, which is the recovery up until the Great Recession, the kind of boom period of the 90s and 2000s, and the productivity puzzle period, which we've been up to until recently, where you've got an incredibly slow rate of recovery for various reasons, which I've listed, some of which are there: austerity, gig economy, increasing employment, not so much a high rate of output, Brexit-related uncertainty from 2016 onwards, other factors which we'll come on to later. And, it really brings it home when you think that, it took about 4 years, in other words, by the time you get to 20 quarters, for productivity to get back to where it was pre-recession in the era we're in now. And the big question is, what will the next recovery period look like from the COVID-19 recession? Thanks, Richard. I think next one. Now, we know that in the spatial terms, the UK's productivity problem is also very much a geographical problem. Disparities have been widening for quite some time, more or less since the 1980s onwards, depending how you measure it. So what we're looking at here is labour productivity indexed to 1981, and the local authority districts which make up the typologies are grouped into whether they're kind of all the way from villages, rural areas, all the way up to other cities, core cities, and London. And really, whether you split this by a kind of income quartile or by the type of area, as in this chart, you see the same kind of widening picture. But what's striking for me when we looked at this more recently, or updated ONS data, is London suffers probably one of the greater falls in productivity from the Great Recession. And it brings home the point that even the strongest areas are not immune to productivity shocks and downward shocks. But what distinguishes London and some other areas is really its ability to bounce back and recover. And so it's really perhaps the kind of that initial shock and severity and where we are now, more or less in the COVID world, is perhaps less important to think about than the ability to recover and regroup. And we know from work we've done on resilience and vulnerability that it's those weak areas that are usually the least able to recover and regroup in the same way that London and other areas can. So this is one of the key issues that will come out of the COVID recovery. Is it going to be the same pattern, and are the weak areas going to still suffer further as a result of this, or can government policy change things, or some other factors? Next slide, please, Richard. So just recapping a little bit on Richard's sectoral profile, but from a different lens. This chart on the left-hand side compares the Great Recession with the current recession. Now, obviously, the current situation we're in is only just beginning, so you can't really compare too much. But if you take the first quarter, in other words, February to April of this year, and compare it with the March to January 2008, the onset of the Great Recession, and do a quarter-on-quarter growth of what happened by sector, you can see the different, you can see the scale effect of what's gone on and how huge the COVID recession is compared to the broad spread, which wasn't particularly sectorally focused from the Great Recession, at least initially. Now, we can't say much more than that because things are evolving, but it just gives you a scale of these things. And we also know that some of the sectors affected most are spread out across different areas of the country. So in the example on the right-hand side map, you've got tourism, which largely relates to the accommodation and food services sector, the hardest hit. And you can see there those areas, local authority districts around the country, which have the highest share, and therefore on the surface would be the most likely affected. Now, there are plenty of other characteristics that typify the COVID recession and its impact. For example, ability to work from home, SMEs, all these kind of things which have different distributions. So it's by no means a complete peripheral versus London and the Greater Southeast in terms of the effects, but there is an element of this which is affecting the peripheries and the weaker areas more already than those more populous and prosperous areas for a number of different reasons. So we are bearing that in mind clearly when we think about these things. Next slide, please, Richard. And when you think about these sector impacts, it is tempting to take all of these sector impacts that we've seen so far and just apply them down to different geographies and say, okay, we know accommodation and food services is hit very hardly. We know motor vehicles is hit very hardly. Just assume those kind of hits are the same in each sectors across all different areas of the country. And it's kind of a bit seductive to do that because it's a sector information is known, it's greater knowledge about it, less about the different geographies and how they're being hit. And this is what we've done here on the right-hand side map. Basically, in April, the OBR took some macro sector output assumptions relative to a baseline and all the way through alongside the sectors that we saw earlier. And what we've done here is assuming that all sectors in a given local area hit the same as the national, this is the kind of map you get. And the headlines at the time are all about how most areas are being hit outside London and the Greater Southeast and so on, which is partly true, and it's an impact. But what we thought we'd do is dig a bit deeper than this and look to see what previous recessions have told us and recoveries in terms of the ability of taking these top-down macro sector assumptions and pushing them out to output, employment, and productivity. And we did this across 3 levels: NUTS 1, which is the standard planning regions; NUTS 2, about 40, and LADS obviously got about 380. And what you see is when you compare what actually happened in the recessionary period of 2007-9 and the recovery period after that up to 2018, so the actual growth that occurred at these levels for these indicators, and what would have been predicted had you applied the sectoral growth that actually happened during these periods, ignoring any local effects, that it doesn't actually explain huge amounts. So you find that recessionary periods are a lot more difficult to predict than recovery periods, which stands to reason because they're shorter, more disruptive, lots of things going on, whereas recoveries are much longer periods of time. Typically, things get set in. You find that employment can be tricky to predict because labour market effects, particularly in recessionary periods. But productivity is even harder to predict because it's obviously the ratio of these 2 things, but yet that's what we're trying to focus on. And also the kind of more detailed the spatial level you go, the more things there are going on that move away from the pure macro sector point of view. So there's more that local side of things. If you're into the shift share decompositions, that local part is much more important the further away you get from the larger regions. Okay, final slide, please, Richard. Oh, no, skipped a couple there. Bear with us.
I was just going to say, Ben, sorry, that table, those are correlations, aren't they? So
Yes, they're
one,
correlations. So they basically give you the a degree of association with the kind of actual output growth and what would have been predicted. So the final slide, very briefly, as Rob's waiting in the wings. So another aspect of the dimension of looking at beyond sectors is the kind of tasks people do, the occupations they have, because often these, certainly in the current crisis, can be seen as more important as purely what sector you're working in. It's what you do within that sector. So another angle, this time at travel to work area level, was to look at which occupations allow people to work from home using the ONET occupational data from the US. And this shows very much a peripherality effect of outside of the kind of central England, London, Great Southeast again. There's a large proportion of people who can't work from home. And obviously these have been hit by either being laid off or put on furlough, and the impacts of these are yet to manifest themselves once these schemes run through after the autumn. So important dimensions there to bear in mind. Other side of things is to really consider when we're looking at the recovery and the longer term impacts of productivity is what the drivers are of productivity, and whether we think this time the COVID recession will impact these in any different way so as to give a different trend performance. And there have been debates on either side in terms of the agglomeration benefits to productivity, whether this is the end of cities or whether they not quite the end, but whether that ability to bump into people is going to be the same as before, given that more people might be working from home. Offsetting that, you might argue that firms might have a broader access to skilled labor, because if more people are working from home, you don't necessarily have to be based near where you're working in order to work for those companies. So there could be a wider access to pool of labor a bit. So these things could offset each other. To my mind, what's more important probably is the investment angle. Uncertainties created by COVID are continuing to delay investment plans in the same way Brexit did, vote. So this is going to continue to depress investment opportunities, and combined with the government policy so far as announced, build, which is really, I think, focused mostly on jobs, quite rightly initially, but I don't see much in policy plans that are really going to be aimed at boosting productivity. So my downer to hand over to Rob probably is that I think what we're going to see coming out of this is another flatlining of productivity recovery, possibly even slightly lower than before, as the focus is on jobs, and you've got that double whammy of the kind of the COVID effect and the Brexit effect coming online. So on that positive note, I'll hand over to Rob.
Thanks, Ben. And while Rob shares his screen, this is the point in the webinar where, of course, I ask you or remind you to put your questions in the Q&A that we can respond to. So yeah, do that as we go along. Over to you, Rob.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. This is going to be something a little bit different. This was research that began before the COVID, trying to look at issues in the long term about productivity changes at a spatial level, thinking about behavior within places, and in particular thinking about cultural factors and psychological factors. So it's an ongoing research of my colleague Piers Thompson at Nottingham Business School, and we're going to try to convince you that maybe in the long term we need to maybe sort of dig a little bit deeper into thinking about changes within productivity. So what we argue is, yes, we take on board all the well-known factors in terms of the impact upon productivity, some of which Richard and Ben have discussed this morning, as well as thinking about innovation around human capital. We accept that, but maybe we can dig down and cut into the argument a little bit lower, thinking about basic human behavior and how it varies across places and how that may impact in terms of around productivity. So empirically, we look at Great Britain and we look at local authority areas. And we've got two key constructs. One is around personality psychology. So thinking about the distribution of people's personalities, and also what we call community culture. We try to bring these two together and make an argument that they actually in the long term are having an impact in terms of productivity and also around economic development as well. So again, we're thinking about the long term. We've seen some very contemporary data there from Richard and Ben. Perhaps we could take it back. This is some quite nice data from Nick Crafts, looking at his estimates of productivity or GDP per capita at least, 1891, 2015. I could have updated it, but we can see some of the differences over the nuts one regions as it is, and we've seen this sort of continuing growth over the last 100 or so years across the south of England broadly. And then we can see some of the places within the north at the bottom, around Wales as well, the northeast. This gradual shrinkage in terms of economic development and productivity performance as well. So if we think about in the long term, what have been some of the driving factors, particularly within regions such as Wales and the north, particularly where obviously the heartlands in terms of heavy industry around coal fields. This is quite sort of nice quote from Jeff Bright, who's doing research particularly around education and culture in particular areas. And he says with some of his research, when he's been looking at some, I think mainly around the north, there's almost this sort of social haunting in a way, in terms of sort of expectations and this knowledge or lack of knowledge in terms of what can actually be achieved. And for some of this sort of resonates with some of the work around Simon around sort of bounded rationality in terms of how much do people know and how much can they compete. And it seems to be there is some sort of spatial boundedness in terms of rationality in a way, which maybe draws back some places and allows other places to actually progress. And again, Ron Martin was mentioned earlier, he sort of constructed this around the idea of sort of positive lock-in regions and negative lock-in regions. And maybe there's some interesting sort of ideas around why some places, again, have obviously grown productivities and others seeing this shrinkage. Often now we link it around the institutions, around having economically efficient institutions, the agents, the actual individual actors that develop these types of institutions, whether sort of government institutions or more informal. And then below that, issues around change and cultural change. It would seem that maybe what Bright was saying, that in terms of some of these negative lock-in regions, they become sort of culturally sort of stasis in a way that they've almost stopped developing, and they're sort of lacking diversity. So what the work I've been doing with Pete is try to think about how we can measure some of these cultural factors, and alongside that, maybe some of these issues around personality psychology, which has sort of come into the literature over recent years. So we've started off with the sort of the community culture and trying to measure that. And I'll give you some indicators around that, and also this idea around personality psychology. So what we've done, this is in a paper that's under review at the moment, we try to bring the two together. We call them the sort of the psychoculture of the place. And we argue that this psychoculture has some kind of impact in terms of the levels of economic activity in areas around entrepreneurship, innovation, network, some of these known sort of more Schumpeterian factors that underpin development, and also productivity as well. So we got these sort of two factors coming together, which we thought was fairly novel in terms of our theorizing. Then I was asked to review a book by a famous economic historian, Joe Mockier, The Culture of Growth. And this is his own model. And you can see on the left-hand side that he's sort of got the two factors again around culture and then genetically transmitted traits, which I guess could be related to issues around personality. I was thinking as soon as we put our diagram together, we're going to be sort of, people are going to say we're sort of plagiarizing Mockier, but actually I developed the idea before I saw this. And in a way, sort of heartening that it seems to be that we're thinking on similar tracks in a way. So in terms of how we might measure personality psychology at the local level, the one that we draw upon is often used within the psychology literature is the big 5 traits around how open people are, maybe how conscientious, are they extroverted, introverted, more agreeable, or maybe a bit more grumbly, and then this measure around sort of neuroticism or more emotional stability, which is, so they got these 5, and we can measure some of these. I'll come on to how we do that later. And then in terms of the community culture, this is taken from a paper myself and peers published in Regional Studies back in 2015, and we developed our own 5 measures around community culture. In this paper, we're trying to see links, particularly with entrepreneurship. A place is more likely to work with through collective action, thinking about things about risky action, social rules, people willing to take risks. Again, we can make some inferences in terms of connections with entrepreneurship. More caring and feminine, think about engagement with the female workforce and some of the activities undertaken. Social cohesion, and the opposite of that being maybe social diversity, and the idea to embrace the workforce, or to embrace education as well. So we got these 2 measures, and we got 5 sub-measures for each, is what we draw upon. And we got these 4 hypotheses, mainly drawn from the literature. The first one is around, we suggest a link between some of the personality factors and productivity at the local level. And the literature sort of tells us if places are more conscientious, open, and extrovert, what we call a co-personality profile, may be linked to levels of productivity within a particular area. And then for the cultural one, we call it an EDI, engagement of work, obviously, and education, and diversity, sort of the opposite of social cohesion in a way, and then individualism, the opposite of the collective action. So we call that an EDI, cultural profile. And then the hypotheses 3 and 4 are the suggestions around the interaction between the 2 coming together. And what do they have, either positive or maybe even a negative? We sort of hedge our bets in a way. We go in the hypothesis 3, we sort of suggest maybe there's going to be a positive relationship in terms of the interaction. And then hypothesis 4, maybe it's a negative relationship with the 2 coming together. So that's our underlying thinking in terms of the conceptualization. There's a lot of words on this methodological approach. I'll just briefly go through it. We're looking across some 360 local areas across the UK where there's good data. The personality psychology data is drawn from this survey that was commissioned by the BBC and was managed through at University of Cambridge. They got about 600,000 responses from individuals across the UK, which gives a fairly good sample in terms of working at the local level. So we've worked on putting together local level measures. For the community culture, we already built that in a way with a paper that we've done for regional studies. We have the 5 measures around there. We've mainly drawn on secondary data. And what we've done for each, for the personality and for the community culture, we've developed a single indicator. We've looked particularly at the relationship with factors which we think are driving growth around entrepreneurship, innovation. So we've put together this single measure instead of having sort of 10 measures within what we work on is a regression factor in the end. And then we put in some other controls as well. So we got this measure. We know around, we've already really seen this, I think, with Richard and Ben, this is the measure around productivity. We got the distribution of GVA per employee across the local authority areas. And again, we can see this sort of clustering around the southeast, particularly around London. And then, as we know, it's a well-known picture in terms of unevenness across the north and spread into the west, particularly within Wales. If we look at our measure in terms of personality, this is our co-measure. We can see maybe the highest concentration in terms of the co-measure. Again, with most people tend to be conscientious, open, extrovert, partly around sort of the southeast London as well, but we can see some other hotspots in other areas as well. And then just briefly around the cultural profile, this tends to be more concentrated again around the southeast and seems to show a similar sort of distribution with productivity. If we just put together some scatter charts, this is a scatter chart for GVA. I just asked my daughter to, can you turn it off? She's making herself a cup of tea. She hasn't closed the door. This is the correlation between the co-measure personality and also the GVA per employee. So we begin to see there's a positive relationship between the two. And this is the one for the cultural profile, a stronger relationship in a way. But again, what we're trying to do is do a regression analysis, building in a number of other factors. This is probably the main takeaway from the paper. So we put in various controls, various other factors as well to try to control for what may be differences in productivity. We've taken a measure of 2017. The main interest for us are the top three rows, and broadly it shows that there is a strong relationship between personality psychology and the community culture and the measure of productivity, which is particularly strong in terms of the community culture. If we do the interaction measure, personality psychology by community culture, there's a relationship, there's a significant relationship, but it tends to be negative. Hence, we put in the hypothesis 4 I mentioned earlier of why it would be a negative relationship. And it would seem to be my sort of interpretation of it. If you have a strong community culture, which sort of, aggregate measure of behavior, that is going to have a big impact in terms of productivity, and that sort of dampens the individual psychology measure. If you're in a weaker region where you haven't got this community culture as strong as some of these other regions, the personality psychology, maybe individual actors, individual agents can have a stronger impact in terms of overall behavior and hence productivity. So we're hoping from the data it gives an indication that maybe there's some relationship between some of these behavioral factors and productivity over the long term. So what may be in terms of thinking about the implications for moving forward with policy, obviously with this idea of leveling up. We're going to see, again, with some of this was mentioned earlier, we're going to see the significant impact from coronavirus, particularly on some of the weaker regions. We're going to see there's going to be less investment in a way in particular areas. And if there's going to be less investment, we need to think smarter in terms about where we can invest at the local level and where we're going to see the biggest buck, I guess, in terms of bang for our buck. So our argument, and I guess it would be, is policy development needs to think about the behavioral profile of particular areas and then think about how we can have particular behavioral public policy levels of intervention. Already we see some of this in terms of around education to try to change culture, institutional change, building new institutions, either they be informal or informal. Maybe less has been said in terms, lots has been said about behavioral nudges, but less has been said, I think, with regard to economic development, and maybe there's some opportunities around that. And we know in terms of a nudge as well, it's something that is trying to change the choice architecture of people within a particular area, but not change their economic incentives. So to me, then that falls short of being sort of an institutional change. And the literature tells us that it should be more cost effective to do that, etc. in a way. And when you start reading some of the literature around it and what's happening in particular areas, actually identifying particular individual regional champions and exemplars, be they from the public sector, be they from the private sector, they can have a big influence in the long term in developing an area, so making information available, personalizing this information, and again, thinking through the different choice options. So, we need to think, I think we haven't thought about some of the policy development enough at a multi-level way. And in the paper, we mentioned one initiative in Wales from in the past, something called the Technium initiative, which was an initiative, I think, from the WDA at the time, to develop a series of business incubation facilities across Wales, which I think was a very laudable, idea in a way, and what is needed for someone for a place like Wales. But I think it was put in sort of, they were developed in certain localities with the hope that they would be successful. Some were, some not so much, and some closed. And it doesn't come as a shock to me, again, maybe thinking retrospectively. If we looked at sort of some of the behavioural profiles of some of these areas where these techniums were actually established, they didn't really have the profile that you'd expect that there was going to be demand for these types of entrepreneurship and innovation initiatives. And they didn't seem to be coupled anything in terms of thinking about nudges. I was reading quite a nice book by Jason Potts, and he was discussing the idea about, just little nudges in terms of thinking about innovation vouchers, etc., have a big impact in terms of attracting people to actually take up bigger ideas around innovation, entrepreneurship, maybe to house themselves in a place such as a business incubation facility. So I think thinking about those different layers around nudges, institutional change, and education is the way forward. I feel we can have more smart making policies. Just to conclude, so what we've tried to do in this paper is to argue that some of these behavioural factors, particularly from a cultural and personality psychology, can provide some new insights into the persistence and the unevenness of productivity over the long term. We think it's, again, this interaction between culture, which is sort of more of an aggregate measure of behaviour within a place, alongside the sort of the personality psychology factors, form what we try to sort of formalise as being localised behavioural systems, which can have either a higher or lower propensity to sustain long-term productivity. We're not arguing that there's clearly not a direct relationship between these behavioural factors and productivity, but we think that they're influencing these intermediate drivers, which we tend to discuss and which tend to be well known, as I've said, around sort of innovation, entrepreneurship, and human capital. And again, so over the long term, perhaps we need just to dig down another level in terms of understanding how productivity varies across particular regions and localities. So I'll leave it there, Richard. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Rob. Maybe you could stop sharing your screen and you can see each of the speakers. It just struck me that, so you've focused on trying to explain differences in productivity levels as a sort of cross-section. I'm just wondering if the behavioural indicators that you identify as potentially relevant, I wonder if they would tie in to Ben's thinking about which places have bounced back more rapidly from previous recessions. In other words, whether as well as being a long-term driver, it could also be a sort of resilience kind of driver as well. I mean, you don't know that, obviously, but it'd just be an interesting way to tie those together.
Well, we did do some work on the Great Recession, just around the cultural factors. We published a paper in Cambridge Journal of Regions, actually, and we did show that there was a relationship between the influence of these cultural factors, which varies whether you're in a sort of a growth period at a more macro level or a more recessionary period. And we found that when things are growing, it would seem to be that the individual, the more sort of London-based factors, might say sort of push places on, but maybe things around social cohesion, collectivity, etc., come through to the fore more and more have a stronger influence, positive influence in recessionary periods. So there is variability, I say, depending where we are in the economic cycle.
So that's interesting. So we've got a few questions in the Q&A. I'll just take them in the order that they're there. So from Shweta Sharma, what would be the impact of COVID-19 on the cross-border migration of skilled and unskilled labour and on demand and supply for firms in the UK? So the impact of COVID-19 on cross-border migration, I guess cross-border international migration. Though I guess it's probably also relevant for intra-regional migration. I don't know if you have any reflections on that, Ben.
Yeah, I suppose if you split it into a skilled and unskilled, skilled workers have probably a greater propensity to be able to work from home. So you've still got access to that pool of labour, who then won't also have travel time. And of course, the problem is that all this is compounding with Brexit as well. So you've got the removal of rights from freedom of movement of working in Europe towards a points-based system, and how that compounds with, can people then work from home abroad? Are they subject to the same rules if they have contracts? I'm not entirely sure on that, but I would imagine that the ability, as demonstrated under the current crisis we're experiencing, the ability of people to work from home and the technology improving all the while to enable people to do that, will help to offset that benefit of the physical proximity of skilled workers being close to each other, and that kind of that bumping into each other effect, the agglomerative effect. So I think that's going to be less of a problem. The unskilled is trickier, certainly if we're talking about international borders. There's more of a workplace requirement there for people to be in the factory or doing the task that's required of them. And certainly if there are second waves coming through, already kind of hints of this, that's going to impose restrictions on people coming from different countries. And, we've already seen chartered flights bringing in seasonal agricultural workers. Maybe there'll have to be more of that in the form of specific travel corridors to allow firms to bring in unskilled workers where there isn't the supply of those within the UK. And I think it's going to be a trickier one than it is on the skilled side.
Right, thanks for that. So a few more questions coming in. So a related question to that one on immigration, about then for your work, Rob, the impact of labour immigration on these cultural and psychological factors. I mean, I guess, is that about to what extent can the factors that maybe act as a drag on productivity, on stronger, higher productivity, do you think they change as a result of changes in the population, in other words, by people moving in, as much as anything? If they do, does immigration then play a potentially important role, on lack of immigration, the opposite?
Yeah, it's a good question. I didn't really touch it upon in the presentation, but thinking about, about policy, what can be done. A lot of this is around sorting, really. Is around sorting not just the firms, but the sorting of individuals as well. And maybe one of the positives, one of the few positives potentially coming out of this, I think, is some of the sorting factors can actually potentially develop some of the weaker regions and localities, as sort of Ben was mentioned, maybe moving out from a hot spot to a weaker one. And then once you move into that area, maybe an entrepreneur who can develop businesses, or other workers, skilled workers, who can start to upgrade the economy in terms of not just productivity, but board around innovation as well. So if places are going to change, there's only two ways they can change, really. It's either indigenously, isn't it? Maybe through the education system over the long term, or I guess, is to attract these individuals. And maybe there's going to be, as you say, maybe more of a push in certain ways for people to move out, maybe from some of these more expensive areas. And maybe, this actually will see some leveling up. I've been doing a little bit of research around this. I think there were processes that are already in train around this in terms of some of these changes. because given that obviously, the growing disparities in terms of the cost of living, already some changes around there in terms of interregional, intercity migrational factors. The expectation would be, I think, that COVID is probably going to accelerate some of this. But again, there's a range of other factors, as Ben has mentioned, that could impact in terms of productivity as well. But yeah, it'd be interesting, obviously, to analyse, and I think maybe could have some desired impact in terms of, as I say, some of the less developed regions.
There's an interesting question from Emma Buckman about, is there such a thing as an ideal culture or ideal behaviour? I mean, is that might be an implication of your work, Rob, that you're kind of pointing to, if only a place could get this, these kind of characteristics, then it would be a success. Or I'm just wondering whether, is that right, or would we always expect there to be differences, say, between large cities and other areas, and maybe different characteristics?
Yeah, it's a tough one, really, thinking about whether you could say that some place actually, has good behaviour, so the opposite would be that someone has bad behaviour. Again, if we sort of put, say, London, for instance, when obviously it comes fairly high in some of these traits around individualism, and then some place in the north and Wales come higher in terms of sort of collective action, more socially cohesive. So should we try to switch the north and Wales to look like London, or maybe see some of these advantages, see some of these other things around collectivity, etc., as being an advantage? And I think some of the sort of policy interventions in a way are working towards this. I've seen in Wales some issues around sort of development more around social enterprise, for instance, which can draw on this sort of strength around collectivity and around social cohesion as well. So we know, and there's a lot of literature saying you should not try to sort of mimic other areas and mirror others in a way. I may be thinking about, I mentioned about the idea around the techniums and some of the issues that they run into. At that point in time, if they'd thought about maybe issues around sort of like social enterprise developing, which there has been more of an influence around that, they can have some more positive influence. I think we need to be careful in saying that there is an ideal behaviour. And as I said earlier, the sort of this behaviour, the impact in terms of productivity can change given other conditions as well. But I think it's interesting just to think about the mix between the personalities. For me, it's around having some key agents within a region, as I said, be it from the public or private sector, driving forward development, acting as these role models, building these nudges, and actually spread, I guess, a sort of a cultural environment that pushes forward the regional locality over the long term.
Thanks. Yeah. I read a book a few years ago by an American psychologist arguing that America's, United States, tendency to have greater development of entrepreneurs was all to do with the influence of international immigration in the past, and the kind of people who take the risk to emigrate. So for another day. Ben, there's a question for you about will agglomeration still be a big investment incentive as work patterns change? So I guess that plays into the kind of the city is still going to be the dominant success because of agglomeration effects, or might that change in a different way?
Yeah. Well, I mean, traditionally you split agglomeration benefits into two: the kind of localization and urbanization. Localization is all about supply chains and clusters of companies in different sectors that work better together. And then the urbanization bit is all about density of activity, whether that's people living in an area or kind of people working in an area. I'm less caught up on agglomeration as other people are. People, I don't know, it seems to have been picked on a bit like transport investment has been, as one of those things that the UK is really lacking in, and we need to have more of it. I don't think we do. We're one of the most urbanized countries there is. And most of the studies on agglomeration have shown that really the actual benefits of agglomeration to productivity are not that huge. The latest, I mean, the main one I cite is an American study which showed about if you double the city size in population, you get about a 4% boost to productivity, which isn't isn't that great. I think there's much more to be gained by, getting firms investing more, and reducing this uncertainty, that cloud of uncertainty that we've been hovering over since 2016. Now maybe that will, once things have resolved next year, in terms of relations with the EU and trade agreements, that might be unleashed a little bit. But anyway, that aside, I digress. Coming back to the agglomeration thing, for what it's worth, I think the urbanization part, there'll still be part of it, and but it will probably be a bit less than it has been, for reasons Rob was talking about and I was talking about. If things pan out in the sense that more people work from home, decide that actually I don't need to live in an expensive London bedsit, I can work wherever I want. This could have the benefit of both widening the pool of labour to firms wherever they are, certainly for skilled labour anyway, and enhancing the places where people decide to live for their amenity benefits. So there could be a double benefit from this. As to whether there's a downside in terms of people not being congregated physically in one place on a regular basis, if that's the way it works, then that I think remains to be seen.
Yeah, do you remember you and I were involved in a piece of work covering the Northern Powerhouse region, where we were looking at different scenarios for how economic development might play out. And one of those scenarios was more distributed working because of the opportunities of technology.
Nothing to do with COVID.
No, it was before the crisis. And I can remember at the time thinking, yeah, is this very likely given, we've had this technology around for a while and still, maybe if we have to live with this virus for longer term, might be a push in the other direction. There's a couple of questions about comes to do with policy. So one says, this is related again to your work, Rob. I completely agree that cultural factors are a hugely significant component of regional inequality linked directly to place. Has policy caught up yet? And if not, what will it take? And then I guess a more specific and immediate one, what might this mean? I guess it doesn't say what this is, whether it's your work, Rob, or more generally the crisis. What might this mean for influencing business support at government and at growth hub, local enterprise partnership level? So, one is policy aware of it, and secondly, I guess more specifically, what might be done either in central government or more locally.
I don't think policy has caught up. I think there's some interesting local initiatives, but I don't think it's caught up at the national level or even at the development national level yet. And I think one of the issues around this really is because we are thinking about the long term, and we know in things of thinking about the long term that political expediency, etc. There's so much volatility over recent years as well within the economy. I think there's more attention to these factors elsewhere. I actually think there's more attention to this. You mentioned, Richard, within the US. I think in terms of some of the agenda around that, in particular states of the US. So I think there's some work to be done, and what we're trying to do is sort of argue, there's been the Behavioural Insights Initiative, etc. within government, hasn't had the focus yet around economic development. Maybe there could be some more exploration around that. I'll leave it there on that one.
Okay.
The final word to Ben, maybe. I see it's 1 o'clock.
Yes, Ben. The final word on that, or anything else that's come up in the question time.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just still, we know a lot about the regional disparities that exist in the UK, and we have learned a lot about, I think, the resilience of places and what affects their resilience. But that we also know that every shock is different, and so you can't necessarily take all the lessons learned from previous downturns and recoveries and apply them to the next one, because each shock has its, as we've already discussed, peculiar characteristics and impacts. But you know, I think there is a role for government, clearly, in kind of helping business support. But it's just very tricky to see how much that's really going to change. If I'm looking from a productivity perspective, whether things are really going to have a step change and get back to anything like what was a trend recovery that we've seen from the Great Moderation in my chart. And I really just can't see much evidence of that happening, and I can't see huge evidence of kind of support being targeted purely on the lines of economic requirements, shall we say.
Okay, well, with that, let's draw things to a close. So thanks very much, Ben and Rob. Thanks to you all for joining us, and for the people who've offered questions. Thanks to Kat and the Productivity Insights Network team for setting up the webinar and organising it for us. And look forward to seeing you at that September in the COVID webinar series. Okay, have a good afternoon.